Good afternoon. Welcome to the EPM latest live Q&A session. I'm Alex Hawkins. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Director of HR Services at EPM. I'm delighted to be joined today by colleagues from EPM, Avec and Southalls. We entered 2021, as you're very aware, with uncertainty around the education provision. Although the government's announcement removes some of that ambiguity we are highly aware of the challenges it brings for you and your teams. Which is why we thought it'd be an opportunity to ask us your burning questions today and provide you with support and guidance to help you through this term. Our scheduled live Q&A session, which is still due to go ahead on the 19th of January, and there's no change to that. We've decided, however, to hold this impromptu session to respond to the latest government announcements regarding COVID, schools closing to pupils, remote working, furlough, and all the other topics and range of questions that the team are encountering at the moment. Therefore, don't forget, do join us on the 19th. We're keen to see you there still, and we'll be discussing some questions on a broader range of topics, although I'm very sure there will be still some burning questions around COVID. Do also bear in mind that this is a fast-moving area, and therefore the answers provided in this session will likely to go out of date at some point. So do check in on our FAQs, which we keep up to date, and also do check in with your HR advisor, who's always up to speed with the latest developments. We are continuing to keep the FAQs up to date as new government guidance lands and as the situation continues to evolve. So that should always be the first port of call, but don't hesitate to pick up the phone either. The team will always be pleased to hear from you and support you. This session is expected to last no more than an hour. It's also, if you have a question, on the right hand side, you'll see a box where you can post your questions. If we don't get time to answer all of your questions today, we will follow them up afterwards and ensure you receive a response to your query. Thank you to those who've submitted your questions in advance. We are going to kick the session off with some of those questions. Now, our first question today incorporates two submissions we received. The first is, has there been any development regarding furlough of staff that are only employed for roles covering private income streams, so for example, wraparound care, and staff who have dual roles, so that might be somebody who does wraparound care and is a teaching assistant in a school. Can staff be furloughed on a rotational basis for their entire role if they cannot be furloughed for an individual contract? What about lunchtime staff, where a proportion of income is paid from Key Stage 2 meals? So that's quite a complex area. Now that merges with the second question, very similar, which this answer will cover as well, which is, what is the current position on schools being able to furlough staff that are paid from incomes which are now reduced or lost indeed? Can you furlough staff on these contracts if they also have additional contracts funded by school budget allocations? Now, I'm going to pass you first of all to Richard, who joins us here today, to answer this question. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. That's very kind of you. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Richard Smith. I'm Head of Product at EPM. And we've got, as Alex indicates, quite a broad set of questions there. So I'm going to take a moment to describe what's happened. So the original furlough scheme that came into force close to 12 months ago now was fairly inflexible and required employees to be furloughed fully or not at all. Over the course of 2020, it became recognised that that was a problem and that there needed to be some flexibility in furlough arrangements, and they were introduced in the middle of last year. So we have something that allows for flexible furlough. Flexible furlough means that you can have employees who are furloughed for all of their time, for part of their time, for every other week. Really, any pattern that operates can be accommodated through the flexible furlough scheme. Within the school setting, we know that there are certain roles where this is likely to be an issue, because we have people who, for example, work in out-of-hours school clubs. We have people who work in dinner type positions where income streams might have fallen whilst employees are no longer required. So what's the position? Well, the DfE are saying, firstly, yes, you can use the furlough scheme, but bear in mind that you're also still in receipt of government funding. And one of the things they've been really clear on in the latest guidance is that they will be looking subsequently what's happened with schools, and if they find that there has been an increase in reserves while people have been claiming for sums through the coronavirus job retention scheme, then they'll look to recover at some point in the future in some way. So we do have to be reasonably careful as to how we deal with this. DfE have also been clear that it can be the case that you can use the furlough scheme in those sorts of instances I was just describing, where there's been a fall in income associated with a particular role. So if, for example, you can't run your out-of-hours school club because the parents aren't sending the kids there, or because you can't safely operate it, and you've got a falling income, then you can furlough the staff associated with that particular level of income. And what essentially DfE has said is that if the fall in income is, say, 4% for the school, then you can furlough essentially 4% of your payroll. So you have to have a sort of an alignment of the amount of time that is furloughed with the amount of revenue that is lost. So it doesn't need to be precisely the same, but there should be some recognition of that, and you shouldn't be exceeding the amount of reduced income in terms of the claims that are made for furlough. There is also some indication that it might be now that furlough can be used in situations where employees are necessarily needing to undertake childcare, for example, because their children can't attend school. We think on the whole this is not going to apply significantly in our sector, because mostly, of course, we're dealing with critical workers, and as key workers, as critical workers, the children of staff concerned should be able to attend school. But there may be some isolated cases where, provided that we apply the general DfE guidance, that might become relevant. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, that's really comprehensive. Thank you, Richard. So our next question is in regards to paying casual staff when the school is closed. Should they pay 80% as they've done previously? Again, Richard, I think it's probably in this area is an area for one for you to pick up as well.
Yeah, again, very happy to do that. So the situation here will vary according to how the people concerned have been employed. So there is a difference where people have been employed, for example, directly by a school. There is a difference where people have perhaps been employed through a third party, or indeed where they run their own businesses supplying their labour. Where people are on payroll, where they're paid through the PAYE scheme, it might be appropriate in some cases to consider furlough for those staff. So, for example, in relation to exam invigilators, we saw this in the 2020 period, that government was sort of encouraging schools to recognise that they still receive funding, and that it may be appropriate to retain their workforce by providing some funding directly to those people they employed. Not mandating that it must happen, not creating enforceable rights for the workers concerned to make those claims, but providing that as guidance that it might be the reasonable thing to do, provided that you're still in receipt of those funds. If, however, the worker was engaged through a third party, so they are on the books of another third party, then what came into force was something called PPN 0220, and that was expanded by PPN 0420. So these are essentially notices from the government in terms of how public procurement ought to take place, PP, public procurement. And they recommended that organisations in the public sector, contracting authorities, should continue to fund the people who supplied them in order to maintain their supply networks. But before doing that, they should make sure that there wasn't a possibility of dual recovery, i.e. that you didn't find that there were circumstances where you were paying, for example, an agency to maintain staff, but the agency were then also seeking funding via the coronavirus job retention scheme themselves to pay those staff, so they were essentially being paid twice. Now those schemes have come to an end. The PPN 0220 and the PPN 0420 schemes came to an end at the back end of October. We're advised by the Crown Commercial Office that there are no plans to introduce a further set of provisions. So I think the probable position that we find ourselves in at the moment is that for those people who are casual workers employed by a school directly on PAYE, it might be considered reasonable to continue some form of payment if they can't be redeployed at the 80% rate that we saw previously. But if that isn't possible, or if the school doesn't want to do it, there are no enforceable rights for those workers to insist on being furloughed. And if they don't have a contractual right to be paid, then it would be possible to put them onto essentially no work, no pay arrangements. And for those third-party contracting bodies, again, they don't have any legally enforceable rights to be paid at the moment.
Many thanks, Richard. We've had a number of questions come in live to the session, so I'm just going to pick up on a couple of those at the moment. First question here is, can we request support staff work their contracted hours on different days or times to usual? Elaine, would you mind picking that one up, please?
No, that's absolutely fine. Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name's Elaine Hammond and I'm one of the assistant directors who works in the HR advisory team at EPM. Yes, of course you can request, and I note you use the word request, whether support staff can work different contracted hours and days. Ultimately, it may not be in their contract the specific days, but very likely, well, the hours will be in their contract. And it all depends, in effect, as to whether an individual can accommodate those and is willing to do so. For example, an individual may work for you on a Monday and Tuesday and may work for another employer on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So that wouldn't be possible necessarily for them to switch their days to later in the week when it may be that you wish for them to work. But by all means, ask them. There's not a contractual right for you to enforce that because they've got specific contracted hours and there's custom and practice in terms of their working hours. If in the long term you needed them to work different hours and different days, then of course we could do a formal consultation to change that side of things, and whether or not that would result in redundancy or not would depend upon the change that you're requesting, or whether it could be accommodated by the individuals. I suspect what you're looking for is something a bit quicker than a restructure consultation. So as I say, by all means ask the individuals and see if you can actually come to some agreement that works for both parties.
Thanks ever so much, Elaine. Okay, so the next question is around staff not performing in their probationary period. Given the current situation in schools, schools are obviously understandably finding it difficult to conclude probation. What should they do in these circumstances? Elaine, would you mind picking up on that one as well, please?
No, that's absolutely fine. OK, yeah, so we have been asked this question quite a few times, really. It's a difficult one because when you're looking at someone in their probation period, what you really want to do is assess them when they are undertaking the role as it should be and as they've been recruited to undertake. But we know that's not been possible for quite some time now. Saying that, given that we're in the third national lockdown and it's only set to go until February half term, hopefully, many schools should be able to sufficiently assess whether an employee in their probation period is performing to an appropriate standard. For example, if they started in September, that should give you plenty of time within the school setting to assess whether they've actually going to meet the criteria. Clearly, that is subject to no further extension to the lockdown. However, for example, if an employee started in January 2021 this month and they're off work due to home working, or the school is unable to assess their performance as they're not working within the full remit of their role, you may wish to extend that probationary period. What I would say is make sure you're in line with your policy, make sure that's a possibility within your policy. Any extension should be communicated to the employee verbally and followed up in writing. And I think it's important to say that if they're not performing, well, if it's a case of you can't assess their performance because they're not undertaking the role, I think you need to be really clear to the individuals that it's not because they're not performing, but it's a case of the circumstances that you're all facing at the moment. I think it's, I would advise that if you are making offers of employment at the moment, that you make sure that the individuals who are being offered know that you might have to address probation differently, so that you might have to look at just a period of time and then look at what the trajectory may be, or that you may need to extend. So I think then people are at least aware, if you do extend it, why you are extending it. I would say also, just as a point, a couple of times I've said in line with your probation, extending it, it's probably worthwhile just having a check of your probation policy and making sure that it does allow for an extension in those circumstances. Certainly if you've adopted the EPM one, if you're an EPM customer, then that does have that in its in the policy itself. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. I think while we're going through some questions here, Elaine, I've got another one which is probably a good one for you to pick up. This relates to pregnant employees, and I know there's been a lot of questions around this coming into the advisory team. We've had 2 questions submitted regarding this subject. The first one is, please can you update us on the current guidance in regard to pregnant ladies working in schools over and under 28 weeks? And the second one is, we found conflicting advice regarding pregnant employees. We have an employee who is 22 weeks pregnant and has underlying health conditions. Should she actually be in school?
Okay, yes, I'm not surprised that people are getting confused. There's been lots of different information out there on the matter of whether pregnant employees should be in the workplace. There has been further updated guidance from the government, specifically about pregnant workers. And that this time, rather than being separate, they've actually referenced other key parties who have contributed to the guidance. So, for example, the Health and Safety Executive has added to that, the Royal College of Midwives. We've also had the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists there within that guidance as well. Now, the government guidance is generic, it's not school specific guidance, but it has been referenced by the DfE. So the guidance is no different to that referred to in the reopening guidance for schools, and it continues to refer to individual risk assessments, which are absolutely crucial. I mean, in any pregnancy, you should be having an individual risk assessment anyway. Clearly, this time you're making sure that they are very much assessed in light of the COVID situation and your setting within the school as well. So just to be clear, the government guidance continues to say, and I'll just quote if that's okay, if you are 28 weeks pregnant and beyond, or if you are pregnant and have an underlying health condition that puts you at greater risk of severe illness from COVID at any gestation, you should take a more precautionary approach, and your employer should ensure you are able to adhere to any active national guidance on social distancing and or advice for pregnant women considered to be clinically extremely vulnerable. So I think that covers both the over the 28 weeks, and we had the lady who was 28 weeks pregnant with underlying health conditions. So the Royal College of Obstetricians still states all pregnant women should pay particular attention to social distancing, which we'd expect everyone to be doing in the school setting anyway. Good hygiene, and it's really important after the 28 weeks and beyond to be doing that. So pregnant women of any gestation should not be required to continue working if your risk assessment doesn't support it. So I'm afraid it really does come back to those individual settings and making sure that you believe and that you've considered all points within the setting. I'd say if any pregnant woman can work from home effectively, and that's the key word, isn't it, effectively, you should really give serious consideration to that course of action as an alternative to attending the workplace. But it really, really is very much dependent on their role and the setting within which they're working.
Thank you. I mean, that is a complex area. Next question is around childcare for key workers, and if they choose not to take advantage of this and are therefore unavailable for work, what can we do? Now, we all know in schools that the majority of workers will be classed as critical workers, and therefore if they've got children, are entitled to a place within school, subject to school having capacity for that. But what if that worker doesn't wish to take advantage of that? Jane, can I hand this one over to you, please?
Thank you, Alex. Hello, everyone. I'm Jane Warburton. I'm a senior partner with Avec. So in terms of this particular question, I don't think that the advice has changed very much right throughout this particular period. Firstly, you need to seek to understand why the individual doesn't want to put their child into their specific educational provision. Understand, is there a context around this? Is there perhaps somebody in the household with CEV? Does the child have a particular health condition? Those sorts of things to try and get a feel for why this person doesn't want to attend work or doesn't feel safe to attend work. At that point, you then really need to sit down with that individual and look at all of the options. Is there an option for home working? for either some or part of the contract. It may be that with admin staff that's easier than with frontline teaching and support staff. If not, what other options are available? So is it possible for this individual to perhaps work flexibly? Is there an option for somebody to help with some kind of childcare at some point in the day? Is there an option to reduce hours, to work more flexibly, as we've just mentioned? And also, again, as I've said, trying to understand the context. So, for example, we had a particular instance where there was a member of staff who didn't want to send her son to his special educational needs college, and therefore didn't want to attend work. When we sat down with this individual, it turned out that in actual fact, the college hadn't started testing. They're in the process of setting everything up, and within a couple of weeks they will have the testing up and running. And the member of staff said that she was quite happy once testing was up and running for her son to attend college. And so we worked out a flexible arrangement so that that person could do some policy work from home while we bridged the gap between now and the son's college actually starting the testing. So I think that's the key thing. It's always important to sit down and see what options are available. If after all of that, you just cannot get the individual to change their position, I think what you need to do then is you need to refer to your discretionary leave policy or your leave of absence policy, depending on what you call it. Now, within that policy, there is usually a period, a very, very small period of paid leave of absence for somebody to deal with an immediate crisis in terms of a child who might fall ill or an urgent domestic reason. And it may be that you were able to accommodate that initially. However, if the individual chooses to have a longer period of absence and just refuses to attend work, I think that our advice would be that that absence would need to be unpaid. It would be a period of unpaid leave of absence. It may be that the individual might apply for parental leave as part of that process, but that we feel that that would be the most appropriate course of action in terms of staff who cannot attend work for childcare reasons.
Thank you ever so much, Jane. So our next question now that we're going to move on to is concerning testing in school. What are the options if there are no volunteers to run the internal test centre? And another one that fits nicely into this same area is in regards to staff living with critically extremely vulnerable dependents or who are vulnerable due to age or are anxious about undertaking the new role in school testing. Caroline, would you mind picking up on this one? I think this one would be one for you. Thanks.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for this. Good question. So the Department of Education has shared a large folder with all schools and under resources, and within that there is some frequently asked questions. So if you explore that, one of the things that it tells us to look at is that it details that staff in schools and colleges need to support this testing process. However, if there aren't enough volunteers amongst your workforce, then you will have to make up the numbers using community-wide volunteers and agency members of staff. So it might be that you have a group of exam invigilators that you could utilise, or amongst other suggestions that we've got, it could be that you use parent volunteers, school governors, or you can engage with volunteers through the national networks such as Reach Volunteering. There are hints in this document that under exceptional circumstances, and I think it's key that we emphasise exceptional, you'll be able to get help from the DfE, and that might include the use of military personnel. But again, just to go back, it's exceptional. So for the most part, it will be up to you to look at contractors, agency and volunteers. Schools and colleges have received funding or will receive funding to support them through this process, and a total of 78 million is apparently available for you to go and make use of, and this will be primarily available to help you to engage with agency members of staff, although you will obviously be able to use some of that to getting things like hardcovers for your carpets and mirrors for the testing process. But don't forget, the one thing that you do need to do is make sure that you comply with your duties around pre-appointment checks when using contractors, agency staff and other volunteers. Usually, of course, if that individual is going to be engaged in the testing process or with children unsupervised, that will be enhanced DBS as well. And make sure that you comply to your risk assessments as well when you're involving volunteers with this process. Now, to move on to the second part of the question, I suppose the key thing to remember is if you are or have got staff who are living at home with clinically extremely vulnerable dependents or are vulnerable due to age, the main thing to remember is that this is a voluntary programme. So if you have those members of staff that are concerned about taking part because they are living with those people who are shielding, then they do not need to be involved in this process. But have the conversation first with any employees that do raise any concerns up and consult with them about any safety measures that you're going to put in place, just so you can reassure and make sure that you've firmly outlined really what control measures they're putting in place for safety. Hopefully that helps. Alex, back to you.
It does, that's helpful, really helpful. Thanks, Caroline. Okay, so our next question is what can we do in regard to non-attendance, citing issues linked to COVID, but not directly? So these are things such as anxiety, childcare issues. I'm sure many of you have had those experiences and concerns raised with you. Jane, would you mind, could you hand over to you to pick up, please? Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Well, we've already discussed the childcare issues in the previous answer to the question. I think, again, that the principles are applied right across the board. You need to be able to discuss the specific concerns and anxieties that an individual has. How are you able to allay their fears and their concerns? So one would be to revisit the risk assessment with those individuals. Again, another creative solution is that some of the schools that we've worked with have actually invited these individuals in whilst there've been no pupils on site. So they've invited them after school or before school, and just to show them all of the measures that they've actually put in place to try and help these staff overcome any anxieties. I think ultimately, though, if you are comfortable that you have done everything that you possibly can to provide a safe environment, and that your risk assessments are in place and are revisited, then it may be that you have to have those discussions with those individuals, as previously mentioned, about them taking a period of unpaid leave of absence. Obviously, if the individual goes to their GP with anxiety or stress or something like that, and then obtains a fit note, then you would just manage that in the ordinary way of managing sickness absence. So really, it is, again, I know we keep repeating it, but it very much is about communicating, trying to understand and trying to alleviate concerns from those staff members.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, we've had a number of questions come in live, which I'm going to refer to now. And perhaps Elaine, if you would mind picking up some of the answers to these, that would be really great. A member of support staff was shielding previously and had a letter from a specialist. It wasn't the NHS. She doesn't fulfil the shielding criteria this time, but is still working from home and has made it clear she doesn't feel safe to be in school. She cannot fulfil the full extent of her role at home. How should we address this?
Okay, so this individual's not at the moment shielding, you're saying, at present, but she's obviously very concerned about coming back. I mean, again, it's going to come back to talking to the individual, understanding the anxiety, determining what the risks are, what you can do to actually alleviate those risks, whether it be PPE, distancing, whether they're in another classroom and teaching or small group work. So, I mean, it's very, very difficult in terms of it. If they won't return to work and you feel that actually you are providing a safe environment for them and that you actually can ensure that they can come back safely, then it is a case of potentially And this is very, very much case by case, as many of my colleagues on this call are saying, that the period of time may have to be authorised unpaid leave, but it does very much depend upon the case, what the medics are saying. They may well go off and see their GP and actually get a fit note to cover their period of absence. We've seen that in lots of instances where the individual doesn't necessarily meet the shielding side of the case.
Thanks, Elaine. Okay, now there's been a lot of discussion and questions from schools, particularly the first weekend the schools were due to open, about Section 44 in the Employment Rights Act. This is continuing to rumble, so I'm just going to move to some questions we've received in that area, and perhaps Richard, one's for you to pick up. The next question is, a member of staff said they are enacting Section 44 would support key workers and vulnerable children, but are now saying that they won't do. Can I insist that they come into work? Another similar question on the same topic is, should I still pay someone who enacts Section 44 if there is no work for them to do from home? And also, does a person have to actually cite Section 44 to not attend work under the ERA, or can they just say they feel unsafe to come into the workplace? Richard, I know there's a number of questions there. Would you mind picking those up, please?
Yeah, very happily. Thank you, Alex. So I'll start by describing what Section 44 is, and also the related Section 108. So these are provisions of the Employment Rights Act, and they were introduced originally all the way back in the early 1990s, in 1993. And what they essentially do is say it's unlawful for an employer to subject an employee to a detriment or to dismissal on the grounds that they are, for example, a health and safety representative, or they perform the duties of a health and safety representative. And they've largely been fairly innocuous provisions that haven't been used greatly. But included within them is a provision that says that in circumstances of danger which an employee reasonably believes to be serious and imminent, the employee either leaves or proposes to leave or refuses to return to a place of work, and an employer subjects that person to a detriment or dismisses for them that reason, it's unlawful. So this is what people are talking about when they speak about Section 44. It's that provision that prohibits employers from subjecting people to detriment or dismissal because they've taken action where the employee reasonably believes, and this is, I think, the really critical thing, the employee reasonably believes that there is a danger which is serious and imminent. So that's what the provision says. What does it mean in practice in some of these cases? Well, the first thing to say is that mostly the way that schools and trusts have been operating is to try and make their workplace as safe as possible. They've undertaken lots of risk assessments, put into place lots of mitigation measures, and the provisions, therefore, we question how they would apply in those sorts of circumstances. But there are some practical points to take. So if, for example, you have a situation where you have a member of staff who is reluctant to attend work and who is saying Section 44 or referring generally to Employment Rights Act, the start point would be, tell me more, explain to me what your fears are, explain to me what your anxieties are, and to seek to allay those fears and anxieties by demonstrating to the employee all that has been done in terms of risk assessments, all that's been done in terms of mitigation and control measures. And by so doing, it makes it much more difficult for the employee to say that they reasonably believe that there is a serious and imminent danger, because we have demonstrated that we are taking the appropriate actions to mitigate and to avoid those hazards arising to the employee in the workplace. If the employee is still unwilling at the end of that process of consultation to attend work, then we have to make some decisions as to what we're going to do. And I think there is a risk for employers in this. There's a risk in terms of cases where they say, well, if you won't attend work, we're not going to pay you. There's a risk for employers in cases where they say, if you don't attend work, we won't pay you. In the first case, it might be that the employee says, well, I'm being subjected to a detriment because I've raised a matter of health and safety that I think is serious and imminent. I'm refusing to return to my place of work, and the employer is subjecting to a detriment because they're not paying me for that period. On the other hand, if we say to employees generally, we accept what you're saying and we're not going to require you to attend work, then we may find that we have many employees who decide not to attend work, and it becomes very difficult to run a school. So our broad position is this: if we've gone through that process, we explain to the employee what the measures are that we've put in place. We understand anything specific to that employee. So are they CEV? Do they have family members who are CEV? Is this something that is particular that they are concerned about in the workplace in terms of the way that hazards might arise for them? And we have, wherever possible, taken appropriate mitigation measures. We think it's reasonable to say you should attend work, and if you fail to attend work, then aside from any perhaps small period of time whilst we work this through, it's going to be treated as unpaid leave. Now, of course, just to pick up on one of the specific questions that was asked, we don't expect employees to have knowledge of the detailed provisions of the Employment Rights Act 1996. So it may well be that employees don't say Section 44. What they say is, I don't feel safe returning to work, or they have simply said, I'm not coming into work because it doesn't feel safe. Well, effectively, we have to treat them in the same way, whether they've specifically referred to the legislation or not. But generally speaking, the key point here is the consultation with the employee to get to that point of questioning, can they have a reasonable belief in the health and safety risk, and indeed, do they have an actual belief in it? Because we did see probably about a week or so ago orchestrated campaigns for letters being sent in by individuals who probably hadn't given any particular thought to whether or not their particular work in their particular school was dangerous, but rather were abiding by advice and guidance given by their trade unions. Well, it's not a collective right, it's individual, and it's got to be the employee's actual belief, and that has to be reasonable. And that's what our process is designed to dispel by having that consultative and collaborative approach to resolving issues.
Thank you ever so much. I hope that provides some sort of clarity in that area, which can be quite confusing. Another live question that we've had come in this afternoon, and I think possibly one for Jane, if you don't mind picking this one up, is what is the advice for clinically vulnerable, not extremely staff, still being on the work rota?
Thanks, Alex. Yes, the guidance states that clinically vulnerable staff can still be on the work rota, and there's no reason why they shouldn't, provided you're following the risk assessments and ensuring that your preventative measures and safe social distancing are in place. So that there should be no reason why clinically vulnerable staff cannot attend the workplace or attend rotas.
Thank you, Jane. That's a nice, concise answer. Thanks so much. Okay, Caroline, perhaps want to pick up a couple of questions that have come in that I think are probably best directed towards you. First of all, what approach should we take with staff who refuse to take a weekly COVID test?
Okay, thanks, Alex. That's a really good question. So I think we have to remember again that this whole process, the whole programme of lateral flow tests is voluntary. So it has commenced now, this mass testing within schools has commenced with these weekly lateral flow tests being offered to all adults working in secondary schools and colleges. There is hopes that obviously it will come to primary schools in February. The key from the DFE is it's an offering, it's not an obligation for staff members to have these tests. So the different, if staff members actually refuse to take part in these weekly lateral flow tests, then they can continue to work as normal, like 2020. It's so last year, but it's still the same, and they must adhere to the COVID-19 controls that you've got outlined in your risk assessments. The difference comes about if they're in a position where they have had maybe close contact with a confirmed case of COVID-19. They can then choose to go on and have serial testing rather than self-isolating. And what I mean by serial testing is that daily lateral flow test for the period of 7 days. It makes it slightly quicker than the self-isolation of 10 days, but again, voluntary rather than an obligation. So very clearly said in the FAQs from the DFE, said teachers can't be forced to take the test to avoid self-isolation. It is a personal choice. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. And while we've got some questions around your area of expertise, we've had another one come in, which is, should we be asking for a certificate for staff who have COVID and are still unwell after the 10-day isolation period? We are not asking for anything prior to that. Should we be?
Right. Again, I suppose the simple answer is no. You can't ask for certificates to show that people are free of COVID. One thing, though, you have to think about is that make sure they have completed that full self-isolation period of 10 full days, or and make sure that their symptoms have gone. So if they've gone through that period of 10 days and they're still showing a high temperature, or they're still medically feeling unwell, they should stay off and get further medical attention. However, if they've got just the cough and the I can never say this, anosmia, the loss of taste and smell, they can come back into work. But you can't ask for a certificate. That's not appropriate. What you can do is you can make sure your staff are trained and know exactly what they're meant to do in terms of self-isolation. So back it up with training. Don't ask for the certificate is my advice.
Fabulous. Thanks ever so much, Caroline. Okay, so another question we've had come in, and Elaine, I'm hoping you'll be able to answer this one, is around holiday arrangements. What guidelines for holiday arrangements should apply for non-term time staff? So, for example, a caretaker may want to carry over more leave than the current policy allows, as they can't go away as planned due to COVID restrictions.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Yes, so we're talking an all year round individual, someone working 52 weeks a year based on this scenario that's been put forward. And yes, many policies do state either you can't carry over annual leave or it's a specified amount, and that's very sensible because unlimited carryover could cause operational challenges. In terms of this situation, it's a quick answer really. Carryover is very much at local discretion. It's not a contractual right. What I would say is you're going to want to be mindful of the workload in the following year. And if lots of people are carrying over annual leave, because I'm sure there's lots of people who haven't been able to take their summer holiday, Christmas breaks, or wherever they were heading, they're skiing, then you could end up with some operational challenges. And you're also going to want to be mindful of any precedent set and consistency as well. So be mindful of applying something probably across the board. And I can use ourselves, EPM, as an example. Yes, we've extended our carryover for operational reasons and for this purposes, but we have made it consistent and we've made it operationally okay so that we can still deliver and that it's not that it's unlimited. So yeah, very much local discretion, but consider all of your workforce and how they may respond to that. Okay, thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Elaine. And I think I've got a question here for you, Richard, if that's okay. That's come in on the session. Can I check the rules around training? What training can furloughed staff be asked to undertake?
Yeah, it's a very good question because whilst furloughed staff aren't entitled to undertake any work on behalf of their employer, they are allowed to undertake training. So, and the training that they can undertake isn't particularly limited. So it could be any form of training, as long as they're not undertaking their actual duties, then you're entitled to do that. It could be remote-based training, it could be classroom-based training. Training is permitted whilst an employee is furloughed.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so we've had quite a flurry of questions come in here at the moment, so I'll just keep going through the questions that we're receiving live on the session. Jane, would you mind picking this one up? It's about asking teachers to work remotely for support home learning and asking support staff to cover pupils at school. Is that fair? Support staff cannot prepare the classes, so we find it unreasonable, but the unions seem to have an issue.
Okay, thanks, Alex. There is the ability to deploy support staff to cover classes where they're covering specified work. So specified work is work that's undertaken in terms of teaching and learning. So leaders can deploy support staff to undertake those roles. Where you do deploy those staff, you must be confident that they have the skills and abilities to be able to undertake the roles. You must be confident that you are not diverting support staff from other areas of need, particularly SEND. But also what you should be doing is you should be looking at paying those people in accordance with the correct level of pay for undertaking specified work. So I'm not entirely sure why the unions have a problem. It may be the way in which it's perhaps being presented, but there is specific guidance and statute that says that support staff can be deployed to undertake specified work. So I wouldn't see an issue with teachers working remotely at home and support staff covering groups of children within the classroom, provided again that risk assessments, numbers, and all of those things have been taken into account.
Thank you, Jane. Okay, Elaine, question we've received is, can head teachers put all staff on a part-time rota but make admin department come in full-time?
Okay, and the simple answer to that is yes, you can. I mean, you're looking at each role on a needs must basis, really. I suppose my question would be, if I was one of the admin staff, I'd want to know, why do they need to be in full time? Now, it may be very good reason. It could be that you're completely paper based and therefore they need access to files. It may be that the phone systems can't be switched over and they need people to answer those, and you can't accommodate that from home. So yeah, the answer is yes, you can. However, I think it's very important that if you're operating one thing for one group and another arrangement for another, that you are distinguishing why you are arranging that in such a way. Thanks.
Thanks, Elaine. Got another question in around furloughing. If someone is furloughed because the service provided has stopped and isn't allowed, can they be asked to undertake work elsewhere and be paid by another employer? Richard, could you pick that up, please?
Yeah, so again, it's one of those things that is specifically allowed. So you might be furloughed from employer A, and because you've got time on your hands, decide to undertake employment with another organisation, employer B, and you're perfectly entitled to do that as the employee, and there's no reason why you can't be both in receipt of furlough pay from your first employer and actual pay from your second employer.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so our next question here is for Elaine. Is there an HR view on how many students it is safe to be in a room with for primary or nursery students? Also, the government states schools cannot restrict numbers of critical workers and vulnerable students, but from an HR point of view, risk perspective, do you agree school years groups should be closed if there aren't enough staff? This obviously goes around back to some of the section 44 discussion Richard covered off area. Health and safety, it covers quite an area. Elaine, could you pick that up, please?
I can, yes. And as attendees of this session will know, this is quite a moving area. And even on Friday, we had changes. So I think I speak for all when I say that we know that the Prime Minister made an announcement on the 4th of January. I think that was one we all sat and listened to. And he said that only children of critical workers and vulnerable children and young people should really attend school or colleges. All other pupils and students to receive remote learning until February half term and remain at home, and that's in line with the national guidance. So, as I've said, schools are remaining open to the children of workers who are critical to the COVID-19 response and the EU transition response as well, that's on there, who are unable to safely stay at home. So this was reconfirmed by the government in their update this Friday just gone, so that's Friday the 8th of January. They confirmed in this one, though, this latest guidance, that even vulnerable children or children of critical worker families will remain at home, with places only being made available where the adult or adults cannot complete their role effectively at home. So there is a slight change there, and I think some schools might welcome that change because they're being inundated with pupils and parents requesting them being on site. So the numbers of children in a room, well, that will very much depend upon the setting, and I'm sure you'd expect me to say that. Locally, I've heard from NEU representatives maximum of 15, and I believe that that was also a number that was quoted very early on in official government guidance as well, or DFE guidance. But as far as we're aware, I spoke to my colleagues on this call earlier, and that 15 has disappeared from that guidance. It's not one we can locate, and that so there does now not now appear to be anything official on this in terms of the numbers in class from the government. Indeed, in a webinar hosted by the DfE last week, they were asked this specific question, and they confirmed they have not set an indicative limit, as the number of students can be on site really depends on the individual setting. And I suppose going from one extreme to another, if you think about it, a teacher might be teaching in a school hall, and therefore you can safely accommodate more children safely in that setting. And where I'm a governor, in a very small Victorian primary school, the classrooms are tiny, and that you can't compare that and come up with the same number of children to be in attendance on safely. So the responsible body for the schools is accountable for the health and safety of pupils and staff, accessing its provision. I'm sure they're very aware of that and feel the weight of that at the moment. And so for maintained schools, that's the Allay, and the diocese for voluntary aided schools. And for academy schools, it's the Academy Trust. And what we are hearing is health and safety considerations and the safety of pupils overrides the non-statutory guidance from the DfE and should be the baseline for any schools opening. And certainly I can understand the responsible body's health and safety position will take precedent in deciding how many children they can actually allow to return to school, and that they may well, attendees on this call may well deem it unsafe to exceed a number of pupils and enforce limits. So yeah, and we are seeing that, and we know it's very controversial at the moment.
Thank you, Elaine. Okay, Caroline, I have a question for you here. With staff working increasingly remotely and online, are there any changes to health and safety legislation that we need to be aware of and manage more proactively? So, for example, increased eye strain and requests for eye tests.
Right, thank you, Alex. There aren't particularly any changes that you need to be aware of, but you do need to go back to basics with this and think, and I'm sorry to mention it again, but go and look again at your risk assessment. So if people are working back from home, you will need to consider that as part of your general suite of risk assessments, or you could capture it as part of your COVID-19 risk assessment that I'm sure you've all prepared by now. So as part of that risk assessment and thinking about home working, what do you need to think about? You need to think about how you're going to keep in touch with members of your workforce. Can they do the activities safely that you're actually asking them to do? And what are those work activities? Well, I'm sure you can answer all of those questions, because for the most part, they'll be remotely teaching. But you might be sending people like technicians home to work. So do have a look at what you're asking them to do, and then put in place necessary control measures. Now, the question went on to ask about things like eye strain and DSE specifically. Now, if you go onto the HSE website, there's some really useful information about working from home that you can go and have a look at, and to do with DSE. So if you have a look at that, it will clearly state, and I think it's specifically for this period of time, that people who are working from home temporarily aren't going to be at any more risk, and you don't actually need to ask them to fulfill or complete DSE risk assessments or training. I would say, though, as a safety professional, what you probably do need to do is just to give them some good guidance on how to set up things like their laptops, so that they don't experience any back problems or upper limb disorders later on down the line. So again, risk assessment followed by a briefing note or training, and that will probably see you through that query, to be honest. Okay, thanks, Alex.
Many thanks, Caroline. Okay, another question that we've received is for staff who cannot carry out their role at home. Can we insist they attend school if they are reluctant to attend? Richard, would you mind picking that up, please? Yeah,
very, very happily, Alex. And look, there are some roles that you simply cannot undertake from home. So whilst we've been saying where an employee can work from home, then they may well be able to be allowed to do that. If they can't, then we have to address the situation. It goes back to some of those points I was making around section 44 earlier, in terms of the consultation you undertake with the member of staff. But I do think that if you've been through that process and can demonstrate that in your view that the work is safe, you've got the right risk assessments in place, you've got the right control measures in place, so you believe that the work is safe, the employee refuses to attend to undertake duties, there are no special circumstances relating to their particular role, then I think I'd be saying to that member of staff, well, look, if you don't attend, then we're not going to be able to pay you for the period of your non-attendance. We'll treat it as unpaid leave. And I think if you don't do that, what you will find is that many employees find that they are anxious about attending work and that they are not satisfied by your explanation. So I think pragmatically, that's got to be the stance that we ultimately take.
Thanks, Richard. I think we've got time for a couple more questions before we reach the end of the session, so I'm going to squeeze in a couple more. We have had a flurry. So first of all, one here, I think probably for Jane, if you don't mind. If someone's job no longer exists in lockdown, is it reasonable to temporarily informally redeploy them to a similar role of the same grade within school or working from home? We have a member of staff suggesting that they can just stay at home and do not need to do any work at all when their role doesn't exist with no students in school. They normally manage a detention room, and of course there aren't any detentions.
I think it absolutely is reasonable to informally redeploy that person. You're absolutely right to consider that it needs to be on the same grade, it needs to be at the same level. There still needs to be a conversation taking place with that individual, because it potentially amounts to a temporary variation to their contract. But I think it's unreasonable for somebody to suggest that they have nothing to do or cannot support the school in any particular way or form. So my view would be to bring that person in, have a conversation with them, present the alternative work that you want to give them, and take it from there.
Many thanks. That sounds entirely sensible. Okay, Elaine, I'm going to squeeze one more in before we have to conclude the session, which is actually about annual leave. And obviously the government introduced, you'll recall last year, a statutory right to carry over leave as exceptional because of the COVID situation. Can you just provide an update on that, please?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm probably remiss not to have covered this in the annual leave question I had earlier. So thank you for whoever prompted on this one. And it did cause a little bit of confusion with some of our customers ringing in to speak to us about it. So this came out in March 20 and it directly relates to the statutory annual leave. So that's the 28 days that includes the bank holiday, so the 20+8. And under the current regulations, individuals cannot carry that over. They need to take that 20+8, but the government relaxed that and they allowed individuals and organisations to agree that they could carry that over, and that was in a bid to provide the flexibility that organisations required and to deliver on the government response to COVID. So that's what that relates to, and it allows people to carry that over for up to 2 years. So it's not a right. It's as I said earlier, it's very much depends on the individual circumstances as to whether you do carry that over. But that was just relaxing those working time regs that have been enforced for many, many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Okay. Got 3 minutes left of the session. I think we'll conclude it there. We have, like I said, had a flurry of questions in, so thank you ever so much for sending in those questions, and it's unfortunate we've been able to answer them all. What we will do, obviously, as we've done in previous sessions, is pick up those questions and ensure that we've responded to all of them, and we'll follow this session up with the written questions and answers and circulate to everybody who's attended plus others who haven't managed to, so that you can have access to those and get your specific questions answered. But please don't hesitate to pick up the phone and speak to your team of HR advisors, or look at the FAQs on the EPM website, which there's a vast number there, and like I said earlier, are kept up to date. That's all we have time for today, so thanks for joining the session and we hope you found it useful. Do remember, as I said at the beginning, we are holding our scheduled session, our live Q&A session, on Tuesday the 19th of January, again at 2 o'clock, and we'll be again discussing recent updates and answering more of your burning questions, hopefully including some which are non-COVID related, and I think we've already got a couple around perhaps Brexit and maybe Brazil as well, so hopefully we'll have some broader questions than just COVID, but of course we will have COVID questions as well, because no doubt the scenario will have changed and moved forward since this session. We hope to see you then, and we look out for our recording of this session, which we will email to you shortly after this session. Thank you again for joining.